Hi, this is Maggie Byers, and this is my Chapter 20 PowerPoint. So first I'm going to talk about the nervous system. So this is divided into the CNS, which is the central nervous system, which includes the brain and the spinal cord, and then there is the PNS, this is the peripheral nervous system. This branches out to the rest of the body and basically uses nerves and ganglia to connect the central nervous system to the rest of the body. And the nervous system has three important functions. It's sensory, integrative, and motor. So the sensory receptors gather information, the CNS interprets it, and then motor pathways cause a physical response. And then the meninges, these are layers of protective membranes surrounding the brain and the spinal cord, and they include the dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater. And then also this CSF, or the cerebral spinal fluid, acts as a cushion that absorbs shock and provides nutrients. And then we have the neurons that are inside the CNS. They are densely packed and protected by the bone, which includes like the skull and the vertebral column. And then in the peripheral nervous system, nerves carry signals, and ganglia are clusters of nerve body cells. So these structures allow communication between the brain and the spinal cord and the rest of the body, ensuring that all the sensory and motor functions work together. So now I'm going to talk about the defenses of the nervous system. So these are more structural rather than immune-based, and the bones around the brain and spinal cord provide protection, like we had talked about, from and the cerebral spinal fluid acts as a cushion. But then we have the blood-brain barrier, and this plays a huge role in keeping out toxins and microbes by allowing only small specific molecules through. And then this barrier is great for protection, but it's also a problem when it comes to drug delivery, since many antibiotics can't pass through it. And the central nervous system is also called an immunologically privileged site, and this means it mounts a limited amount of immune response to avoid damaging itself. And there are also microglial cells. These are the brain's resident phagocytes, and some macrophages that help clean up debris, and they also provide immune support. So even though these defenses aren't as strong as in other tissues, they are balanced to protect the vital neural functions. So now I'm going to go a little bit more in on immune privilege and cellular defense. So this basically explains why the CNS is called immunologically privileged. So the central nervous system has a limited immune presence, and the cells here express fewer MHC antigens, which means they don't trigger a strong immune responses like other tissues do. And then we also have complement proteins, which are normally abundant and help kill pathogens. They are less present here and in much lower amounts. But the trade-off here is important because it does help prevent inflammation that could harm the delicate tissue. It also means infections here can be harder to control. And then microglial cells, these act like mini macrophages and help remove pathogens or debris while also supporting neuron development and repair. So some macrophages are also present but aren't as active as those in other body systems. So under normal conditions, both the central and peripheral nervous system are considered sterile, meaning they don't host any normal microbial communities. And if microorganisms are found here, it's always a sign of infection. But there are exceptions, like herpes simplex virus, which can remain dormant in nerve tissue and in between outbreaks, but it's not considered part of the normal biota. But more recently, scientists have started exploring something called the gut-brain axis, and this is basically the communication between the gut microbiota and the central nervous system. And the basic idea is that the gut microbes might actually influence like brain chemistry, immune function, and even behavior. And there is also evidence saying that they could trigger autoimmune reactions in the central nervous system. So now I'm going to go onto the infections of the nervous system. So the nervous system is highly protected but can still be breached by pathogens through the bloodstream or through trauma. And the central nervous system is a closed system, so when infection occurs, it causes major inflammation and pressure that disrupt normal neural function. So, over the next few slides, I'm going to break down the different infections. So there's bacteria, viruses, fungi, protozoa, and prions. And I'm basically just going to talk about their signs, causes, and treatments. So first is meningitis. This is one of the most feared nervous system infections because of how fast it can develop, and sometimes it's even within hours. So the inflammation affects the meninges, which protect and nourish the brain and spinal cord. So when it's infected, these membranes will swell and compress the neural tissues. And diagnosis for this usually requires a cerebral spinal, a CSF sample, which will show high white blood cells and possibly bacteria or viral antigens. And bacterial meningitis is the most dangerous because it must be treated immediately with antibiotics, while viral meningitis tends to be milder and self-limiting. So these are the big four of bacterial meningitis. There is Neisseria meningitis, which is especially dangerous because it spreads rapidly and can cause bloodstream infection known as meningococcemia. And then there is Streptococcus pneumoniae, and this is frequent in adults, while the Haemophilus influenza type B is used to cause severe meningitis in children before the HIV vaccine. And then Listeria monocytogenes. This is a foodborne pathogen that can infect pregnant women and newborns. So all these pathogens begin in the nasopharynx, and they cross into the blood and then reach the meninges, which will then lead to swelling and inflammation. So now I'm going to talk about the fungal meningitis. This usually affects people with a weakened immune system, like those with HIV or AIDS. And Cryptococcus neoformans, this is inhaled from the environment, and it's usually from environments contaminated with bird droppings and can spread to the brain, forming chronic meningitis. And then coccidioides infection begins as lung diseases, but then it can disseminate into the meninges. And these cases are diagnosed by finding encapsulated yeast in the CSF, and then treatment involves antifungal agents. And though it's rare, these infections are often slow onset but become deadly without long-term therapy and treatment. So then there is neonatal or infant meningitis. So neonatal meningitis, this is tragic because it often results from transmission during childbirth or contaminated feeding sources. So group B, Streptococcus, this is the leading cause passing from the mother to the infant during delivery, and E. coli K1, this is another major cause linked to the intestinal flora, and that can cross the blood-brain barrier. So Chronobacter sakazaki has been found in infant formula, and this is very dangerous in premature infants. So prevention of this focuses on maternal screening, hygienic feeding practices, and rapid treatment with antibiotics when the infection is suspected. So this form of infection confines meningitis and encephalitis, meaning that both the protective membranes and the brain tissues are inflamed. So meningoencephalitis, this is inflammation of the brain and the meninges. So the most notorious case lives in warm, fresh water and can infect swimmers when contaminated waters will enter through the nose. And then infections are usually slower and more chronic, and usually in contact lenses or immunocompromised patients. And both of these organisms, the two major pathogens, these are rare, but they're always fatal once symptoms begin, and these can include headaches, seizures, or confusion. So now I'm going to talk about acute encephalitis. So acute encephalitis arises from a viral infection following mosquito bites or reactivation of Latin viruses, and because the brain tissue is directly involved, symptoms can be severe, including altered consciousness or seizures. And then viruses like the West Nile virus are transmitted by mosquitoes, And HSV1 can reactivate the trigeminal ganglion and infect the brain and especially the temporal lobes. And then we have JC viruses. These cause progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy in individuals, in immunocompromised individuals, but others are just seasonal outbreaks. So I'm going to go into arboviral infections, and these vary by region and vector type, but they share a similar pattern. And the viral invasion of the brain tissue will lead to inflammation. And these viruses, they can cause seizures, paralysis, coma, and are especially dangerous in young children and the elderly. So herpes simplex virus, this is one of the most common sporadic viral encephalitis, and it can develop from reactivation of latent infection and cause necrosis of the brain tissue. And then immediate treatment of acyclovir and is crucial to prevent neurological damage. So now I'm going to talk about these 3 causes of subacute encephalitis. So there's different types of pathogens: protozoan, viral, and prion. So toxoplasmosis, this can remain latent for years, but can reactivate in immunocompromised patients. So SSPE, this occurs years after measles infections and is nearly always fatal. And then prion diseases are unique because they're caused by misfolded proteins that trigger other proteins to misfold, creating holes in the brain tissue. And these are resistant to sterilization and have no treatment, which makes them some of the most unique and mysterious infections. So now I'm going to talk about Zika virus. Zika virus gained very global attention during outbreaks because it caused severe birth defects. So pregnant women infected with Zika virus can transmit it to the fetus, causing microcephaly and developmental delays. So Zika can also spread sexually, so prevention includes mosquito avoidance and condom use. But most adults experience mild illness, but the real danger lies in fetal infection and highlights how vector-borne illness viruses can have very severe consequences. So I'm talking about rabies. This is one of the deadliest viral infections with almost 100% fatality once symptoms appear. So these viruses travel slowly along the nerves to the brain and causes inflammation and neurological symptoms like agitation and hydrophobia. Prevention is extremely effective through post-exposure prophylaxis, and this combines rabies, immune globulin, and with vaccines. So vaccinating pets and controlling wildlife reservoirs is one way that the rabies has reduced in countries, but it still kills almost thousands annually. So now I'm going to talk about polio. This is a viral disease that can cause lifelong paralysis and destroy motor neurons in the spinal cord. So this infection usually begins in the intestines and spreads into the nervous system and reaches the bloodstream, if it reaches the bloodstream. So most infections are asymptomatic or mild, but in severe cases, patients may experience flaccid paralysis and respiratory failure. So here's the prevention of polio and features. Polio presents itself in different forms. There's non-paralactic polio, which looks like the flu or meningitis, but paralytic polio causes muscle weakness or paralysis. So even after recovery, some patients develop post-polio syndrome, where nerve damage reappears decades later. And vaccination remains the only reliable defense of this. And the oral polio vaccine provides long-term immunity, and eradication campaigns have eliminated most wild-type strains, although vaccine-derived strains can cause small outbreaks in immunized areas. So now I'm going to talk about tetanus. Tetanus is commonly known as lockjaw, and it occurs when spores of Clostridium tetani enter wounds and germinate oxygen-poor tissue. So the bacteria release tetanospasmin, which is a neurotoxin, and it blocks inhibitory nerve signals. And this causes sustained muscle contraction. So this can then lead to painful spasms, and particularly in the jaw and neck, and can also cause respiratory failure. So this infection doesn't spread between people, but it is extremely dangerous once symptoms appear, and makes prevention through vaccination essential. So now I'm going to talk about botulism. Botulism is a rare and serious disease, and it's caused by one of the most potent toxins, botulinum toxin. And it prevents neurotransmitter release at neuromuscular junctions, which leads to paralysis. And foodborne botulism occurs when the preformed toxin is ingested from improperly canned food or preserved foods. And then infant botulism happens when spores will colonize in the gut after exposure to honey, while wound botulism develops after infection in deep tissue. So each form can cause progressive paralysis if it goes untreated. And last time we talked about the African sleeping sickness. So this sickness is caused by a fly, and it is a flagellated protozoan transmitted through the bite of the tsetse fly. I don't know how to pronounce it. And after it enters the bloodstream, the parasite will spread throughout the body and eventually crosses into the central nervous system. And this infection leads to intermittent fevers, enlarged lymph nodes, and neurological systems as it goes on. But because the parasite changes its surface proteins frequently, the immune system struggles to eliminate it, which allows for long-term infection. And during the early stage of infection, patients may experience fever and joint pain. Once the parasite reaches the brain, though, it disrupts the sleep-wake cycle, and this causes profound fatigue